And now it's time to talk about everything which went down Saturday in Kansas City with Zach Tawatari and Paul Gallant from Gallant and George, ESPN 97.5. Good to see you, Paul.
Good to see you, too.
And also former Texan Seth Payne from Sports Radio 610. Hey, Seth, what do we think of Paul with no mustache? This went down overnight.
Oh, is that what's different? I thought that was his 22-year-old younger brother. Yeah, I like it.
All right, we're going to start.
That lifted my spirits. I'm otherwise got a low-grade depression I'm trying to kick myself out of.
All right, we're going to start with this tonight. One last satisfaction survey. How satisfied are you with the season as a whole? And Seth, you're starting us off.
I got to go with unsatisfied. I had high hopes for this team. I had high hopes for the offense specifically, and they let us down. There were some bright spots, and look, they played a more competitive game in the divisional round this year than they did last year, certainly. But this regression or stagnancy by C.J. Stroud and a lot of other people on the offense, it's just not what I was hoping for. I can't take this low-grade sports depression I have and somehow translate that into being satisfied.
Well, Seth, I agree with you on the depression part for sure, and I'm definitely unsatisfied with how the Texans got there. But with the end result of the season, I'm kind of neutral. This might have been where we expected them to get to at the beginning of the year. They did overcome a lot when it comes to injuries, so I'm a little more optimistic, I guess, on the outlook of the season.
Paul?
I'm unsatisfied. Ever been to a sushi restaurant? When you go to a sushi restaurant, you might have good sushi. Texans were 10-7. They make it to the second round of the playoffs. But you're still hungry afterwards when you go and get sushi. I might be a small fellow. I might not be a former defensive lineman, but I'm still hungry when I go and get sushi. I am unsatisfied with this. You got to the divisional round of the playoffs, but we've been here before. I'm going hungry. I need more food.
All right, so we have a neutral and an unsatisfied, and I'm going to say unsatisfied as well. I think when you look at this team and how it started the season and all the expectations, yes, it underperformed. It underperformed and underdelivered given what we were hoping to see this season. So we end up with neutral and 3 unsatisfied with our final satisfaction survey of the season. So that's what the Texans were saying, and now 24 hours later, should Texans fans still be upset about the officiating, Seth?
Look, I don't want to try to judge exactly what people should and should not be angry about. I think specifically for me, it's not about the officials themselves or the calls they made. It's the fact that the NFL has allowed quarterbacks like Pat Mahomes to basically exploit a rule that's meant to protect quarterbacks. But Mahomes knows and understands that by putting himself into harm's way, he can draw these calls. If he wanted to protect himself, he had a chance to run out of bounds. Instead, he chose to run back towards 3 active defenders and slide late. And the 2 guys who didn't try to target him or anything, because there's no ability to review it, because the foot first slide probably it's just not safe. Most quarterbacks will tell you, don't slide feet first in close quarters like that. He gets away with it. And this is something the rules committee could change. In college, you're not allowed to fake slide. They do it. You don't get flagged for flopping. You can't review these calls. It's asinine. And look, I don't buy into the conspiracy theories people have, but when you have a rule that so routinely causes people to create conspiracy theories, you've got a little bit of an egregious problem. So I'm angrier at the NFL at large than I am the specific calls in the game, because it's a bad rule the way it's officiated right now.
Paul looking like a stadium giveaway bobblehead, nodding his head here.
The rule is really frustrating. The league has gone in a way where defenders are at a disadvantage. I think you're allowed to be angry about the calls as long as you admit it's a secondary reason for the loss. They allowed 8 sacks, and on top of that, their special teams had a horrible day. What I'm angry about is that Patrick Mahomes on national TV is totally okay flopping like that. Imagine if I did that, which I just did on TV, and then afterwards I got mad at Zach here and then tried to sue him with Tony Busby. That's the energy that Patrick Mahomes carries into every football game. It's a violent sport, man. You can't be flopping on the sideline. Kids look up to you.
Yeah. Look at the kids.
Yeah.
I look at, though, the situation that this game was not decided on those penalties. The Texans, the second penalty, the unnecessary roughness, That was the third or fourth play on a drive, and the Texans had more than ample time to stop the Kansas City Chiefs on that drive, which led to the eventual game-winning touchdown. Yes, it is clearly egregious, some of the officials' calls, but it wasn't the sole reason they lost. Not by any means of the equation.
And I also think when you think about how many times the Chiefs play on TV throughout the season, it might get more exaggerated because of the fact that people see them so much on television. However, I hate the fact that Patrick Mahomes is dancing around before deciding to get down. It was so obvious, I think, in that situation. That's why it's frustrating.
Yeah, and that's
the other.
Go ahead, Seth.
I guess to kind of I think to agree with what most of you guys said, which is that yes, there's multiple other reasons they lost that game. Somebody told me that it was clear that the Texans had they were upset because of the bad calls, and that's the reason they couldn't perform in the fourth quarter. Like, I'm sorry. I'm done trying to make emotional excuses for the Texans. I didn't realize that they were depressed the entire season, and that's why they couldn't pass protect. I didn't realize Nico Collins was on the sideline with melancholy. I didn't realize that Dalton Schultz can only block well when he's got the warm fuzzies. No, they've got issues on offense and underperformances. So, no, I'm not buying that there was an emotional letdown because they were upset about a couple of bogus penalties.
And that doesn't even hold water when you consider what you heard from this team after the game, Seth. They knew, based on their comments, that the calls were going to go against them. So they should have been prepared for this.
Well, look, I love this defense. I love the way they play. But you know what? They've also got a reputation for violence at this point, going back 2 years since DeMeco Ryans took over, which I love. But you're also going up against Pat Mahomes, who will do whatever it takes to exploit the rule book. And yeah, that's something you got to be conscious and aware of. I'm not happy about it. I'm not happy that he's able to exploit that, but he is able to do it. And yes, in the fourth quarter, look, the previous Chiefs game, various other games this year, when you don't perform in the fourth quarter, it's everything else is left by the wayside. The Texans just completely fell apart when they got down into the red zone there on that final possession where they could have put the game within reach. And yes, the only person outside of Kansas City who's happy about the officiating right now is Kaimi Fairbairn, because what the heck was that? Why? What? Why don't? What? Either the wind? No. That thing sliced like when I'm at the driving range. Every time, even the one he made.
So you mentioned a few of the issues that this team has had. What would be your number one Achilles heel when you look back at this season?
This team so often talks about learning. Well, don't you have to correct your mistakes to learn? Self-correction's a big part of that, and they haven't done it all year long. And this offensive line, we're talking about a unit that's paid nearly $200 million in total salary if these contracts are paid out to their completion. And I doubt that's going to happen. Best case scenario, these guys just have terrible coaching. But worst case scenario, they're overpaid and they're not as talented as what they're getting. And when C.J. Stroud's running for his life or getting sacked 8 times in a playoff game, what are you going to do? You're going to lose.
C.J. Stroud is among the most pressured quarterbacks in the NFL during the regular season, and he's among the most pressured quarterbacks in playoff history in yesterday's game. It's over 50%. So, yes, it's the line. It's the pass blocking. I mean, it's been the same thing all year, and it gets a little better, and then it gets worse. And then it gets a little better, and then it gets worse. And, of course, it's going to show up against a team who's championship caliber.
I'm going to use this word and say undisciplined, that this team was not disciplined enough. Could that be the Achilles heel, Seth, or would you go in a different direction?
The discipline, I haven't seen that issue on defense. I think there were some breakdowns in play, especially in the linebacking group, that were just poor play yesterday. Offensively, yes, in the first half of the season, they had some serious discipline issues. Laramie Tunsil was on pace to break a record by a huge margin for penalties committed. Laramie cleaned it up. I think that sometimes it just boils down to actual competence, and they were incompetent in too many facets of the game offensively, especially after Stephon Diggs went down. They were not operating efficiently. I don't think at the core of it that they're undisciplined football players. I just don't think they were as good as they needed to be.
Well, glass half empty at this point, but we'll ask this. Has the team made progress at all when it comes to the playoffs? Paul's staying with us, Zach's staying with us, Seth is staying with us as we roll on here on Sports Extra. Now, as we look back, but also ahead, what we saw Saturday and the playoffs as a whole, can that be considered progress at all, given that it was a much closer game than what we saw last year in the divisional round, Seth?
I think for me, defensively on the sum total of the season, I think they made a lot of progress. And they still have some very young players that are going to continue to get better. The defensive backfield, Will Anderson, Henry To'oTo'o, those guys are very, very young, and they're going to keep getting better. Offensively, if I isolate just the game itself yesterday, that drive where they came out and drove down the field and sucked up 10 minutes of play clock on just a methodical drive for a touchdown. They ran the ball really effectively. They ran the ball in the second half last week effectively. That's progress. That's something that, maybe you can hang your hat on that, all right, they figured something out and something clicked. The sum total of it, it's hard for me to give a lot of credit for progress offensively when in the second half of the season, they were one of the worst offenses in the league. But there were some good signs in the playoffs.
I'm not saying there's progress. Look, you're 0-6 in your history in the divisional round of the playoffs. You are essentially a non-playable character, an NPC in a video game. Basically, you are a piece in the story, an important piece, but you are the fodder for premier franchises like the Patriots, Ravens, and Chiefs, the three teams that have beaten you in the second round of the playoffs. You are the mini-boss for Patrick Mahomes twice, Tom Brady twice, Lamar Jackson, and even Joe Flacco. That's what you are. If you're 0-6 and you can't get to the AFC Championship game, that's not progress. I'm glad after the game, guys, that DeMeco Ryans said that he was discouraged with what he saw out there, because hopefully that puts a little kick in their keister going into next year, because I think they got to look at themselves in the mirror and realize it takes a lot more than what they put into this year to get to the promised land.
All right, before we get to our takes, let's go now to Luis Ortiz for his take as he filed this report before leaving Arrowhead Stadium. Luis?
Hey guys, yeah, so I feel like we can go two ways with this question. I do feel like the Texans grew in some ways, and I'm specifically referring to gaining more experience, right? Now they have more experience under their belt as far as playing in these type of games, facing those Super Bowl contending teams. We're talking about the Kansas City Chiefs, the Baltimore Ravens. So now they know what they need to do in order to eventually get over the hump. But we can also say they didn't grow. Why? Because the same issues that they dealt with all season long, they never fixed them, and they were magnified here in the biggest stage. So it eventually came back to haunt them. So they need to go back to the drawing board, and they said it in the locker room after the game. Time after time, they continue to repeat execution. That means because it's a young team, they lack a little bit of discipline, and that's what they need to, as they mature, they need to improve on, to finally execute for the entire 4 quarters and put together a complete game. Reporting from Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City, Luis Ortiz, KHOU 11 Sports.
Thank you, Luis. And progress, I think defensively it showed progress because it was a much closer game against arguably a better opponent. But I can't get all the way on the progress train. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, you hear the term from them constantly this season. We got to stop shooting ourselves in the foot. We got to stop shooting ourselves in the foot. We got to stop getting in our own way. And for me, that's the whole reason that I don't see it as progress, because they continued to make the same mistakes. Yes, definitely there's progress defensively. They became a monstrous defense this year, scaring a lot of teams. But ultimately, I think because they kept making that same mistake, getting in their own way, it's not progress for me.
It will be a very, very interesting offseason. So right now, thank you to Seth Payne from Sports Radio 610, one of the original Texans, for all of your outstanding work all season long. Thank you, Seth.
Oh, thanks, guys. And thanks for lifting me up mildly out of my mild depression. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Paul Gallant from
Anytime.
Gallant and George, airing weekdays on ESPN 97.5. Thanks for being here as well.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, guys.
All right, that's going to do it as we roll on here on Sports Extra.